Oh no! The totodile looks stupid. Hold on. Fuck, man. I thought that I had these. Does that look good? Motherfucker. I wanted to make the background look cool. It looks stupid. If you're wondering, that's my favorite Pokemon in the whole world, Totodile, and then a Sand Seal plush from Tears of the Kingdom. those are my little buddies representing the channel in the background, and yet you still can't see the sign that says Stormy Talks because I put it back there. I'll figure it out. I'll figure out something that works. I'm just freaking lazy. What's up everyone, Alex here, and welcome to my little corner of the internet. I love gender complexities, so I wanted to talk about gender complexities. I do this more than once a week, I feel like. I like to see, I like to take something that sounds like it's so simple, a gender concept, a gender label, and then just do some deep diving, deep digging to see, like, what there is under the surface, because sometimes it's not just so simple as like, I'm non-binary. It's not boy or girl. Sometimes there's a lot more to it, so I want to talk about that. My coffee's kicked in, so I'm here for it now. Non-binary, not entirely male or female. Sometimes that means that you do have a gender that overlaps with the binary, either because you have more than one gender, or you have a binary gender that feels non-binary in nature. I'm a non-binary man. A lot of people might be non-binary men or non-binary women. Some people are just non-binary. It depends on like, non-binary is such a broad term. It encompasses so many different experiences, partially within and entirely outside of the binary. Some non-binary labels fall outside of the binary, outside of neutrality, outside of genderlessness, outside of any kind of convention. Things like Maverick come to mind. Those kind of genders fall within this range. Sometimes it's more than just not male, not female, because a lot of genderless and neutral genders fall under that term, that definition. So some non-binary labels fall even farther outside of that. Some people might be both trans and non-binary. I know that a lot of people are like, well, non-binary does technically fall under the trans label, but some people, a lot of people who are non-binary don't call themselves trans, while others are both at the same time. That's definitely my experience. I'm both transgender and non-binary at the same time, but a lot of other non-binary people might not consider themselves trans. And it doesn't matter what the technicality is of that. Like, if they don't feel like transgender is the term for them, then they're not going to want to use that term, and that's fine as well. The whole point of this video is that terms are a lot more complex than you might think they are. Agender is another one that sounds like it would just be a simple, I don't have a gender. But sometimes, someone who's agender might also have another gender. So they might be demigender, where they are partially some kind of gender and then partially agender. They might be Libra gender, which is mostly agender with a connection to typically a binary concept, but they can have a connection to just about anything that exists, masculinity, femininity, neutrality, anything really, anything that is not genderless in nature. Agender might be a way to remove yourself from the concept of gender entirely. Someone might be an agender woman, and that means that she still connects to womanhood, but is otherwise removing herself from the concept of gender and sees her womanhood as outside of gender. Some people might be genderless as a result of genders canceling each other out. Though people might see this more as neutrality, sometimes it's, two genders coming together and it creates like a genderless experience, rather than just simply being genderless on its own. Maybe it's genderless because some aspect of your gender is behaving in a certain way that causes that genderlessness. Demigender is another one that has some complexities. Someone might be demigender because they have multiple genders. Somebody might be mostly a certain gender, like mostly male, and there is another gender that keeps it from being 100%, which is pretty much my experience. I am mostly male, and that neutroid part of my bigender identity prevents me from feeling that I am fully 100% a man. Still a man, just not very strongly so. Someone whose demigender might just be partially a gender and that's it. Like, just saying, like, I'm a demi boy and there's no other part to it. It's just I am partially a boy. There's not a 100% gender happening here where I'm 75% demi boy and then there's like a 25% somewhere to make up the rest. Sometimes you're just partially gendered. I think I've personally forgotten that that can be a thing because when I first came out as a demi boy, I thought like, okay, I'm this percentage of boy, so what is the other percent? That turned into, oh, it turns out that I'm actually bigender. But some people just are partially gendered, and that's all it is. Some people who are demigender might have equal parts of gender, like 50% one gender and 50% another gender. Someone might be demigender because multiple parts come together to make up an identity. There might be like, I'm Maverick and a little bit of neutroid and a little bit of girl and a tiny bit of gray gender, maybe some androgyny, and it like comes together in varying amounts that creates one entire demigender identity. It is important to remember that demigender is an entire identity. You don't really have to see someone as like not completely gendered or not completely a specific gender, like as if you're kind of only sort of non-binary. It's still a whole identity in and of itself that can be made up of entire parts that come together to create the whole that is demigender. Someone might be demigender and they don't specify the gender that they are. They just know, oh, I'm like, I have part of a gender, like I don't have 100% a singular gender. I just feel kind of 60 or 70 or 80% gender, or even a smaller percentage of that. They might feel that they definitely are demigender. They just don't have a specific word for whatever gender they are demi of. You can also experience demigender in fluctuating amounts where you might feel 5% one gender one day and then like 80% of that gender the next day. The amount of genderedness fluctuates, but the base gender stays the same. It's as if the amount of malehood that I experience fluctuates. Like I'm still a man, but like in varying amounts depending on any given day. Another gender would be epicene. That is lack of a gender distinction is basically what epicene means in the context of a gender that you identify as. It's neutrality. Neutrality in that behaves almost the way that androgyny does. Androgyny is the combination of masculine and feminine. But if you were to take that and make it almost exactly equal parts, so they kind of neutralize and create a gender that does not have any distinction. It doesn't look like both masculine and feminine, and you can't decipher any masculinity or femininity. That's basically what epicene is. A true neutrality that does not lean one way or the other, while also being a specific type of gender experience. Someone might see their epicenity as sitting between multiple points that cause that feeling of neutrality, rather than just being neutral on its own, ambiguous on its own, indistinguishable gender on its own. It may just sit in the middle of all these different parts that kind of make it feel like it is centered neutrally, not leaning any way anywhere, but it still feels like you sit between those genders. Kind of similar to centrogender, I would say. Some people experience epicene as a centrogender. People might be epicene and experience gender ambiguity that's not neutral or centrogender or genderless. It kind of feels like it's just an ambiguous gender that exists by itself without the mid-binary concepts and without being lacking of gender or even of a neutral gender, just kind of existing on its own as ambiguity. There can be epicenity that exists as something that feels like it's Otherin in nature, Maverin in nature, abinary in nature, like something that exists outside of pre-existing genderedness, that doesn't really fit with any other specific gender descriptor. So speaking of androgyny, I've talked about androgyny as, it doesn't have to literally be combinations of masculine and feminine coming together, especially traditional masculine and feminine qualities. It sometimes can be literally sitting right in the center where it feels like a pure androgyny without any kind of gender distinction into masculine or feminine. Someone might feel androgyny in a way that runs parallel to the binary. It's not masculine or feminine and doesn't feel like it is a combination of them or sitting in between them. It feels like androgyny that is proximal to the binary and more of an abinary androgyny, something a little more complex where it lies outside of the binary and doesn't compare itself to binary concepts. Androgyny can also lean more one way than the other. So someone can be androgynous with a more masculine lean or a more feminine lean. You don't have to be androgynous and be perfectly centered between masculine and feminine. It can kind of have more of one than the other quality, depending on how that person wishes to experience androgyny. At least as like a presentation, androgyny also can manifest as a gender, like an actual gender experience, where an androgynous gender would be like someone who's bigender and they're both a man and a woman. That can also be androgyny. It's not just the gender quality or the presentation of one's gender. It can mean that you are of a binary experience, both binary genders at the same time. So I've talked about abinary as an identity that exists far outside the binary, compared to non-binary, which is not fully binary. So non-binarity can overlap with the binary, whereas like abinary is usually used to distinguish itself as being outside of the binary without any kind of relationship to it or overlap to it. That also includes neutrality. Neutroi is an abinary identity, and it's not far outside of convention. It still kind of lies within conventional gender categories, but abinary can also be far outside of even neutrality, which is where you get otherinity and maverinity, and also xenogenders sometimes. You don't really call xenogenders abinary, but sometimes your abinary gender feels like it's even farther outside the concept of gender, just depending on the individual experience. I've talked about being a non-binary man. People can be abinary men and women as well, where they feel like their manhood or womanhood isn't binary, not traditionally binary. It feels like it lies outside the binary, but, socially, they may still connect with the idea of being a man or a woman, just in an abinary way, in a non-conventional way. This also can manifest as like a neutral gender that feels like it's Otherin in nature, where like it is neutral and also outside of neutrality at the same time. Kind of a complex paradox type of gender in that way. There can be an abinary gender that is transmasculine, transfeminine, transneutral, trans anything. Anyone of any gender can have any gender quality. So people who have an abinary gender can be masculine or feminine, neutral, anything. For example, if you're Maverick, you can be transfeminine. If you're Neutroy, you can be androgynous. I'm a man, but I'm also transmaverin. Kind of like the flip side of it's an abinary transness with like a binary gender, but you can also have conventional transness combined with a binary gender. There can be genderless abinarity. Some people who are genderless, agender, gender void might not call their gender abinary because it's a lack of gender identity. So they might not call themselves non-binary or abinary or transgender. Like none of those terms fit them because they don't have a gender. And that means they like no gender identity, no gender quality, no transgender identity. But some people might consider their genderlessness as abinary. They might want to kind of highlight the fact that their genderlessness exists outside the binary. So they might combine the two to just call it a genderless abinarity. I've talked about centrogenders, genders that are in between other genders, that it's typically been discussed as a gender that sits between two genders. That's typically the centrogender experience, but centrogenders can exist between more than two genders. They can exist between 3, 4, 5 genders, and they are not a combination of those genders, but feel like they are approaching, like they're approaching from those different points. It's so hard to explain centrogender because centrogender is not a multigender, and it's not a combination of the two genders that it sits between, and instead kind of is its own gender. But you can kind of compare if you feel like you sit between like male and neutroy. In the center would be neutrome, which is a centrogender that's between the two, and it's not a combination of the two. It's its own gender that you can compare it. Like I'm between man and neutroy. I don't lean like one way or the other, but I mean it might. Some people might consider their centrogender as combinations of the genders that they kind of sit between. They also don't have to be similar genders. Centrogender doesn't have to be between genders that are related, like two binary genders or two neutral genders. They can be wildly different genders all over the place. You can have a gender that feels like it's between male and agender and stargender and androgen, and none of those things are related, but the unifying gender is that centrogender, whatever that may be. Someone might have a name for that. Very complex. Someone might have not a word for that, but more of a like, I feel like I'm between these genders. At a certain point, it's very hard to name centrogenders when they start getting very, very complex and involving more and more identities. Someone might have a centrogender that exists in between every single gender, which sounds like it would be pangender, but it's centered in between all these genders rather than being a combination of every single one of those genders. It's almost like it's kind of it's similar to epicene, which can feel like it sits between genders and kind of neutralizes. There could be a central gender that exists between every single gender. Maybe it has some aspects of those genders, like little bits and pieces of them, or maybe it just feels like it kind of misses all those genders and just sits right in the center. I've talked about the complexities of bigender experiences. I put it on this list because it's relevant to my experience, where bigender isn't always just one whole gender and another whole gender together. Some people might have one gender that's fluid and one that's static. One gender might fluctuate while the other one is static. One can be fluid and one can be fluctuating. You can consider these as a bigender experience because it's two aspects of a gender, or two ways that gender is kind of behaving, rather than just having two static genders. You can have two partial genders and still be bigender. You can call it demi-bigender. I've seen that as a term, but you can just call it bigender even if it's two partial genders coming together. It feels like that's kind of my experience, where it's mostly a man and partially neutroid. I've always thought it was a 75-25, but it also might be an 80-20 situation. I don't know if it's changed over the years, or if it has a tendency to change as a fluid or fluctuating identity. I have no idea. My bigender experience is one singular, solid, unchanging, unfluctuating gender, and maybe I tip more one way or the other on sort of a seesaw situation. That's probably the best way to describe that, if anything. But I don't consider myself gender fluid or gender flux or anything like that. I have two static genders that feel like they change in amounts just any given day. Some people can have two similar genders, where it's they might be both gender void and agender, or they might be both epicene and neutroid, where it's two similar genders, but they're still distinct genders in their own way. Someone might have a bigender identity that becomes a singular gender because two genders combined to make it. So it's I'm both a man and a woman, and maybe those two kind of combine together to make a singular gender, like neutroid, or even genderlessness, or something just vaguely androgynous that doesn't really have a name. That can also be considered bigender. Going over all of these: non-binary, agender, demigender, epicene, androgynous, abinary, centrogender, bigender. Those are all, when you think of these terms, there is a set definition in mind. You look it up and it gives you this is what this term means. But sometimes there's underlying complexities that aren't included in the definition, because people will take terms like these and kind of sort of shape them in a way that works for them, rather than sticking to the literal book definition of these terms. So you don't have to call yourself non-binary and that is your way of you are strictly a singular gender that is not male or female, with no other clarification. Sometimes it means that you're outside of male, female, and neutral and genderless, and outside of all of convention. It just depends on how people want to use these labels for themselves. I've always been a big proponent of use labels in a way that works for you. Don't use labels if you don't vibe with them, even if you technically fit the definition of those labels. You can choose not to use a label even if it does technically describe your experience, and you don't have to use a label. You can use a label even if you don't fit every single literal definition of that label. You can use it in a way that works for your experience. Use it as a way to describe your experience. That's the whole point of having these labels, is that we make them work for us. And they are so much more than their literal definitions. I want to go into the complexities of specific types of labels, deeper and deeper. Like, this was just kind of an example of a bunch of broader labels, but I think it would be cool to talk more about, like, I talked about non-binary as a label, but maybe very specific non-binary genders. Like talking about the complexities that lie within those, rather than keeping it broad. At some point, I will talk about that, but for now, I'm signing off for now. See you later.